This incident happened to a woman named Rebecca Foster, who was living in Ohio in 2011. Rebecca was a woman who lived alone. That day, after coming home from work, she ate her dinner as usual, watched TV, and went to bed a little after midnight to sleep. At 2:47 a.m., she woke up to a sound. It sounded like someone was walking around in the kitchen. Her heart started pounding fast. She knew she was alone in the house. The windows were locked, and the door was locked. But the footsteps coming from the kitchen were very clear. Rebecca called the police without leaving her bed. The police told her to stay where she was and lock the door. They also stated that officers were on their way. The footsteps were approaching the bedroom. Rebecca could see the steps coming toward her from under the door. The person approaching her was trying to unlock the door. Rebecca panicked and whispered to the police officer on the phone, "There's someone in front of the door." The officer told her to stay calm and that the officers would be there in no more than 5 minutes. But at that very moment, the man had managed to open the door. When the police arrived with sirens blaring, the footsteps quickly faded away. Rebecca didn't have the courage to open the door. When the police arrived, they thoroughly searched the entire house, but there was no one inside. The police noticed that the front door was unlocked and the back door had been left open. But the most frightening moment of the night came next. Rebecca didn't know who the key belonged to. It wasn't a key that fit any of her doors. This was terrifying. The police noticed that the basement door was slightly open and found an old sleeping bag and an empty food container inside. Had someone been living in her house for days without her knowing? Rebecca had decided to move out of the house. She went down to the basement, the last part where she needed to collect her things, and found a sentence written on the wall in pencil. "I have always been watching you." It sounds very creepy, doesn't it? Rebecca called the police again, and an intensive investigation was started in the basement for any possible fingerprints or traces. However, the suspect was not an ordinary person as one might think. He had lived there for months without leaving any traces on any of his belongings. But as you may remember, Rebecca had mentioned hearing a sound from the kitchen. The suspect likely thought Rebecca was asleep and planned to grab food from the kitchen. And yes, despite being very professional, he had left a trace in the kitchen cabinet. However, the police team had spent so much time in the basement that they didn't notice the trace in the kitchen until much later. During this time, the suspect must have found somewhere else to hide, right? The fingerprint found belonged to a 32-year-old man named Henry. The police spent days and weeks searching for the suspect, and by then, his identity had been confirmed. Henry could no longer enter Rebecca's house, and the police didn't think she would return there. However, as you may remember, Henry had written, "I have always been watching you," in the basement, and Rebecca knew the location of her new house. She had taken all possible precautions, but Henry had already made smarter plans. He had somehow managed to infiltrate the basement again and was living in Rebecca's house once more. He was playing a major role on the police's watch list, aware that he was being searched for. When Rebecca went to work during the day, Henry could act freely in the house, feeding himself and taking care of his needs. He also knew exactly when Rebecca would return home. Yes, as you might be thinking, Henry was a true professional. Henry would return to the basement near the time Rebecca was due to arrive, but one day, he had had enough of living in the basement. Rebecca had gone to work again, and Henry was comfortably staying at the house. By sheer chance, Rebecca returned home early that day, and Henry was unaware of this. As Rebecca approached the door, she noticed the lights in the house were on. However, Rebecca hadn't turned any lights on during the day, and because of the terrifying experience she had lived through in her old house, she immediately called the police again. The police thought Henry would still be there, and yes, Henry was living with her once again. But the police, arriving with sirens blaring, drew Henry's attention. He couldn't escape out the front, as the chances of being caught anywhere else were very high. So, he grabbed a knife from the kitchen, escaped through the back window, and managed to break into a neighbor's house. Henry temporarily took the neighbor hostage. Meanwhile, the police had begun searching the house again, but Henry was only a few steps away from them, and no one was aware of his presence. After failing to find any trace, the police left the house. Rebecca, traumatized by the terrifying events she had already experienced, couldn't remember what she had done and assumed she had left the lights on. She entered the house thinking it was an innocent mistake. Henry, after threatening the hostage, left the neighbor's house and went back down to the basement. That night, Henry managed to enter Rebecca's house again, and just like before, he began making noises in the kitchen. Rebecca was sleeping in her bedroom, completely unaware of what was happening around her. Henry, on the other hand, was someone who enjoyed spreading fear. His sole purpose was to scare others, to give them terrifying nights, to make them uneasy. He would constantly choose different victims and live in unused areas of their homes. Henry continued to make noises in the kitchen, aiming to leave Rebecca with a terrifying night. He knew she was asleep, and he would make sounds, then create silence, trying to figure out whether Rebecca had woken up. He was a true professional. When Rebecca didn't wake up from the noises coming from the kitchen, Henry pushed things even further. He approached the bedroom door, making the situation even more critical. He tapped the door twice and then moved into a dark, desolate area. Rebecca suddenly woke up, startled, trying to understand what was happening. Henry noticed she was awake and began emitting terrifying laughs. Rebecca's situation worsened, and the only thing she could do at that moment was scream and call for help from her neighbors. Rebecca screamed, asking for help, but Henry didn't anticipate being confronted with such a situation. Rebecca fell into a crying fit, unable to think clearly, her only way out being her screams. Henry, in panic, thought about running outside to escape, but he knew the police would catch him. Henry had no other option left. He managed to escape as far away as possible from the cameras and watched Rebecca's house from a distant spot. Hearing Rebecca's screams, her neighbors called the police for help, and the police arrived at her house soon after. Rebecca briefly explained what had happened, and the police team went down to the basement again, where they saw the following message written on the wall. 4th of February, 2011. Do you think this date was the day he planned to kill Rebecca? Share your thoughts in the comments.